Hi everyone, I'm Emma Hume. I'm the Programme Manager here at Writing on the Wall, and we're here for WowFest Lockdown, our online festival. Welcome back to you all, or if this is your first time, a huge hello. You've missed a lot already. We've had the wonderful Irving Welsh open up the festival for us, and the one and only Noam Chomsky, and A Night with La Violette, but to name a few. Tonight, though, we're here for Media in Lockdown, but before we get going, I just wanted to mention some of the other events that we've got going this week. We've got an evening with writer and comedian Rosie Jones kicking off tomorrow from 6 p.m. Resist, Stories of Uprising with Common Press on Thursday, and on Friday we've got our friend Stuart McConey in conversation with Cash Carraway about his book, The Nanny State Made Me. You can find all of our events on our website, which is www.wowfest.uk. But like I said, tonight we're here to talk about the importance of the media and how it may or may not be affecting us during lockdown. Coming fresh out of an election campaign where many felt the Labour Party leader was vilified and straight into a global pandemic where unbiased reporting has never been more critical. But are we as the public getting just that? In a letter to The Guardian, our host tonight, Des Freedman, wrote, "Democracy requires a free and independent media." Des is a founding member and recent chair of the Media Reform Coalition and was project lead for the inquiry into the future of public service television. His latest books include Misunderstanding the Internet and the Contradictions of Media Power. So I'm more than happy to hand you over now to him. Can we give a huge welcome to Des Freedman?
Thank you very much, Emma. Welcome to everybody who's out there. Welcome to the Media in Lockdown. I have to say that I really like the title, although it's nothing to do with me, I should immediately say, because it makes me think of when the lockdown actually started in terms of the media themselves. Was it the 23rd of March when Boris Johnson made that speech, or was it actually a long time before that when the media became captured and absorbed by the elites that they are supposed to hold to account? But either way, we know that the media are a key actor in this crisis. The publicity for tonight's event that brought you here, it states that, quote, "The media's role of presenting accurate, valuable and unbiased information is more important than ever." Now, no one disagrees with that, really. I know that because I have a quote from the BBC's own Nick Robinson, who wrote in an article for the Times last week. He wrote this, that, quote, "We're in a national crisis. Journalism, fearless and probing, inquiring and curious journalism matters more than ever." In other words, for Nick Robinson, the host of the BBC's Today programme, he's arguing that especially in a crisis, we need accurate information, detailed analysis about how we got here, what we should do now and what the next steps are. And I think what may unite all of us on this panel is that we do not believe we are getting that. And what we have and what you're lucky enough to have tonight are three great speakers, Kerry-Anne Mendoza, Tom Mills and Victor Pickard, who are going to try and make sense, partly through your own questions, of the media's role during the pandemic, to reflect on how they allowed the government to mess things up so badly, on why, or perhaps there would be different views on this, the media have allowed the media have been too complicit with the government's core messages, and that may be different in different countries, obviously. Perhaps the media have been far too late in challenging the government's messages where they have at least challenged them. And not least, and I hope we do have time for this, I must remember to try and get to these questions, not least to try and figure out what a real investigative, critical and independent journalism might look like. Two of the speakers are likely to focus on the UK, but we are lucky enough to have Victor Pickard, who is an American writer and academic, to draw, we hope, on some of the, what's the right word here, the lessons of a country ruled by Donald Trump, but certainly somewhere where these debates are particularly urgent. So we have these three fantastic speakers. They are going to introduce themselves, because it's probably, they will give the most accurate summaries of themselves, but via a first question, just to get us going. Then I will follow up and have a series of other questions. And then we will, in half an hour or so, go straight to your questions. So please do use the comments section in Facebook, and to ask anything, if it's to the panel as a whole or just to one of them, indicate, and then they will be magically transferred to me, and I'll try and get through as many as possible. So I hope that's a sufficient introduction for now. Over to Kerry-Anne to introduce herself and to try and reflect on the first question I'm going to ask is, what has struck you most about media coverage of COVID? Has it reinforced your existing criticisms of establishment media? Has it made you re-examine them in any way? Over to you, Kerry-Anne.
Thanks, Des. That was a great introduction. So I'm Kerry-Anne Mendoza. I'm editor-at-large at the Canary. I co-founded it back in 2015. And I'm really, I don't know how many people watching know, but we founded the Canary in the wake of the 2015 general election, because we just realized that without a transformation of the way that the media conducted itself, there was really very little hope that we were going to get serious political change here. And as capitalism is clearly in crisis, and we do really desperately need to move things forward, the most important place to put our energies was in changing that narrative and kind of almost elevating the ability of the public to do that sort of critical thinking for themselves, and therefore better advocate for themselves. And really, it's only gotten worse since then. I mean, it is almost breathtaking, actually, to me, the pace of negative change that has taken place in the sort of what we would refer to as the establishment media. With reference to coronavirus explicitly, I think some highlights for me. I mean, the first thing, who on earth would have predicted that Piers Morgan would be literally leading the charge on behalf of the sort of the mainstream space? And it's really beggars belief that it's pretty much been left to Piers and actually other morning TV show hosts to sort of step in and ask the kinds of questions, and not just the kinds of questions, but in the kinds of tone that are necessary and reflective of the dire straits that this government has brought this nation to. We are now talking about over 60,000 people who have died, and those are just conservative estimates. They are likely to go up in time. And incidentally, even those conservative estimates are double what the government is telling us they are every day. And repeatedly, those false figures are going completely unchallenged in these daily briefings. And, if someone does ask a question, it's almost as if, we were debating, the price of cheese. It's not, it's not conducted with the sort of really kind of the aggression that needs to be there from the Fourth Estate to really put those ministers on the back foot and force them into a position where they really have to defend their actions or change them. Part of the role that the media has is pointing the public to where they need to pay attention, to where they really need to get up and make a noise in order to advocate for themselves. And right now, most of the media seems to be doing the opposite to that. I think the line we saw, if you remember when Boris Johnson first came out and announced his unbelievable herd immunity strategy, which amounted to, we're just gonna kind of let the virus do its thing, kind of roam around and see how we go, and then we'll build up a bit of immunity. And there was outcry from scientists, from the medical community, from independent journalists, from members of the public advocacy groups. And you had almost the entire media political class in an incredibly patronizing tone saying, oh, you know better than the government's, the government do, you know better than the government's advisors, rather than interrogating that approach when virtually the entire globe, the World Health Organization and every sensible medical or scientific organization on earth was already in line with the test, trace, isolate approach and lockdown. We knew at this point what was happening. This wasn't like we got surprised later. And that was bad enough. And I remember that column by Robert Peston, the title was, basically it was amounted to something like why we need to embrace herd immunity. And then literally the moment the government changed tack 2 weeks later, too late, it was already, we were in that first peak. We'd missed the chance to keep our numbers down at the levels of South Korea and others. And they just volte-faced immediately and said, no, we never, but nobody was ever talking about herd immunity. And it's literally left practically to members of the public and members of the independent media to sort of harvest all of these former columns and, press conferences and videos and stuff. And even when you point it back at them and say, what are you talking about? 2 weeks ago, you were calling us lunatic tinfoil hat people for suggesting that this was effectively mass suicide that we were being asked to conduct on behalf of this government. And now you're saying that it never happened. And that has happened over and over and over again throughout this crisis. It's completely eroding trust in government. The behavior of so-called, government experts like Jenny Harries, who is consistently, I believe, and I think most of us would agree, making political statements rather than scientific statements, is also undermining faith in scientific institutions. And meanwhile, the media's role is undermining faith in media. So all of the institutions that people really need to be able to rely on actually right now, more than ever, when we're in the midst of a crisis where having access to the proper information isn't just a privilege, it's a life and death matter for us as individuals and for our communities. And that trust has become completely eroded. That is not the situation we are in. And so it really is being left to sort of a handful of journalists in that space who are still doing their jobs, and the rest of us outside of it who are working on a shoestring to attempt to perform that function, which is so critical at this moment.
Thanks, Carrie-Anne. That's a hell of an introduction. Thank you. That raises lots of issues we'll try and come back to. We've already had some great questions come through. Certainly one of them is particularly aimed at you. Anyway, let's go straight over to Tom Mills. He's there.
Hiya. Hi everyone. Yeah, thanks Des, thanks Carrie-Anne for opening remarks. I'm Tom Mills. I'm a sociologist at Aston University. I'm interested in elites and in the media. I'm also the co-chair of the vice chair of the Media Reform Coalition. I wrote a book on the BBC called BBC Myth of the Public Service. So like thanks Des, you can see Des is holding up a copy of my book there that he's whipped out of nowhere. So, my main interests, I suppose, or the things that I tend to comment on the most are the role of the BBC and particularly its relationship with the powerful and particularly with the British state. So, Des, your opening question was, I think, like what surprised me the most about media coverage over the course of this crisis. I mean, I'm going to be a bit annoying and say that not a huge amount has surprised me, although I'm not really cynical enough to not find it shocking watching it kind of unfold. I mean, what do we know already about the nature of the kind of institutions that we're talking about? The BBC and the press, which of course exists to some extent in a kind of symbiotic relationship. We know that they tend to take the existing framework delivered to them by the state for granted. They tend to look at policy delivery rather than questioning the motives or the assumptions or the aims of policy. We know that there's a very close relationship between people, particularly in political journalism, who tend to be driving the contours of the coverage, and those people who are in government and the spin doctors. So what gets called lobby journalism. And it creates these sort of symbiotic relationships between reporters and the government. Now, I think in a lot of ways, what's gone on with the COVID-19 situation has exacerbated some of these underlying trends. So, if you think of what journalists are sort of supposed to do in terms of holding power to account and asking difficult questions, well, they don't tend to do that anyway, or at least they tend to follow the lead of what is the kind of elite political conversation. Well, what's happened at the moment, we've seen basically and effectively a constraint of the existing democratic institutions such as in Parliament. We've seen basically the political scenes sort of shrinking to Downing Street, and these orchestrated briefings which are very tightly controlled by a government comms strategy, which now has the kind of moral force, if you like, of being able to control a national crisis. So basically the comms strategy has become more narrowed. It's also combined with the fact that ostensibly independent scientific authority that Karianna alluded to earlier has been, I mean, effectively integrated into the state. You know, these are government advisors, but they're, you know, they're on the government payroll, so they're not what we would usually think of as sort of civil society and the kind of views which the BBC should be representing more broadly outside of the state. So that's what's happened in the context of the crisis. Now, in terms of the media's response to that, I mean, I would say there was a couple of significant things. Number one is, of course, the particularly right-wing, right-leaning nature of the British press, the fact that the current government is very strongly aligned with the press that threw its weight behind Johnson in the last election. You know, there's this sort of vitriolic kind of mood around the press. We would expect them to a degree to be supporting the government, even though the threat of Corbynism has now passed. And the other thing is the role of the BBC and the broadcasters, which are these sort of institutions which traditionally would expect to provide more accurate and more independent analysis. Well, in the context of what's gone on with the BBC, with Johnson initially going for the BBC quite quickly, in fact, even during the last general election, you'd had a sort of defensive response for the BBC, which tends to be the kind of position that it plays. It seems like they saw a political opportunity with the crisis to reassert their legitimacy and authority in British society for good reasons, because public information was going to be important. They could perform an important journalistic function, or at least that would be the argument that the BBC was making. As always, they've performed that in such a way as to sort of balance that public service requirement with pleasing the government, which, to put it crudely, is what the BBC is always trying to do. It's always trying to balance, on the one hand, the fact that it's basically subordinate to political elites in the state, and on the other hand, its legitimacy depends on it offering something like a more convincing alternative to the press. So I think, you know, that's none of what we've seen, and I think it's all very serious. And I think I'm not going to add to what Kerry-Anne said in terms of the contours of the coverage. It's kind of what we'd expect if we start with the kind of critical, or let's say realistic, analysis of what these institutions are.
Thank you very much. That's fantastic. There's a lot to be getting on with. So over to you, Victor Pickard, who is based in London at the moment, but a US academic. So he has the privilege of looking at both systems in a comparative way. But Victor.
Great. Thank you, Des. Thank you all for joining us this evening. This is a great conversation. I'm Victor Pickard. I'm an associate professor at the Annenberg School for Communication at the University of Pennsylvania, where I co-direct the Media Inequality and Change Center. I have a recent book out called Democracy Without Journalism. There was Des's cue, thank you. Again, appears from nowhere. The book looks at how we might radically structurally reform our media system, especially in the US, but it's also aimed at media systems around the world. I think we're dealing with similar problems. Also, as Des mentioned, I have been here in the UK for the past year, where I'm a visiting fellow at Goldsmiths and LSE, and that means I'm torn between two different media worlds. So perhaps it makes me even more confused, but it does give me a chance to compare and contrast differences between these media systems. And in very broad strokes, I would generally say that our print news media are fairly similar in general ways, and also suffering some similar problems, which I'll return to in a moment. The biggest difference is around our broadcast media and our television media. And I don't want to go on the record saying too many nice things about the BBC, but I will say that compared to what we have in the US, the BBC is far superior to anything we see there. Now, to say that you have a better media system than the American media system is not much of a prize. So I absolutely agree with Tom's criticism that there's much room for improvement. As much as I see a stronger public service ethic exhibited by the BBC, even just providing international coverage. I watch the BBC News almost every evening, especially in the early days of the crisis of the pandemic. It serves as kind of a soothing role. And compared to the US, it does provide a broader array of voices. But all that said, it's also very clearly deferential to official accounts. It does not challenge power very often. And certainly we would hope there actually is research out there that suggests a public media system can be as critical or even more critical towards government than its private commercial counterparts. So I think that there are ideals that we can strive for. Certainly, the UK does not want to lose the BBC. You don't want to see it become privatized or defunded or move towards anything like an American model. So you want to fight for it. But I agree with Tom that that also means that we should try to structurally reform it, to democratize it. And I hope we return to that later in the discussion. Along those lines of structural reform, another area of concern right now when we're looking at how our media, and this is indirectly answering Des's original question, but how our media are covering the COVID crisis, a concern is that much are the absences, are the voices that we're not hearing, and at least part of that traces back to the fact that we're losing local journalism. This was a problem that was more pronounced in the U.S. for structural reasons that we might get into later. But when you hear about things like news deserts and the closing of local and regional news outlets, this is something that's very much a problem here in the UK as well. There was a report in the New York Times a couple weeks ago that said over 50 small and regional publications in the UK have ceased publication just in the last couple months. So the news desert problem is something that the UK must confront as well. And that's where I keep hitting on this idea, and not to fall too much on the cliche, but this idea that the crisis is also an opportunity for us to reimagine what journalism could and should be. It gives us a chance to try to reinvent our news media system from the bottom up. And I think that emphasis on not just decommercialization, which I think many, especially in our print media or commercial media, much of this can be traced back to these commercial imperatives. So we need to unhook our media from those commercial imperatives. But beyond that, we need to democratize it. And that gets back to some of the issues related to BBC coverage as well, that it needs to be not just public in name, but truly publicly owned and controlled and governed. So these are just some very broad subjects that I hope we can revisit in our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's great. So if I can just throw a few more questions at you before we get to the audience questions. You're going to have fun with them, right? I'm just looking. But first of all, to Carrie-Anne, and obviously if others want to come in as well, please do. But this is directly for you, Carrie-Anne. There was an article in the Canary, which of course you didn't, I'm not saying you wrote it, but anyway, the Canary made a very important point where it argued that, quote, the blame for the virus can be laid at the door of the corporate press. Mm-hmm. That's a hell of an allegation. So can you just explain that, expand, and maybe give some examples that actually it was systemic media failures that are at the heart of this public health crisis?
I think actually you've done a great job of actually explaining the context of that statement, because we weren't saying the journalists in Westminster took out little cases of coronavirus and spread them willy-nilly around the country. That was obviously not the point that was being made. The point that was being made is that at the critical moment, which really was, late February, early March, when we first started hearing the talk of it became clear how serious coronavirus was going to be globally, not just in China or the surrounding nations. And we were all knew, any sensible journalist knew, you could Google it and find out what the World Health Organization's advice was, what the most effective approaches were, at those points in terms of containing the virus. This is containing it before you hit a peak, to keep that peak as low as possible. All of this information was available. So this wasn't about a lack of information. And I don't think it's reaching to suggest that if at that point, when the UK government said, we're going to take a wildly different approach to this, with no scientific basis whatsoever, and would have made a really, really loud noise and created platforms for those critical voices of that policy that could really have spoken to people of all class, of all ethnic backgrounds, all communities across the 4 nations of the United Kingdom. That could well have had an impact. It may not have. We may have lost that fight, but I do believe it would have given us a chance, because what we have seen is that actually 2 weeks later, when people did start kicking off, all of a sudden Boris Johnson changed tack, even though it was fairly superficial, and we know we've never really been in full lockdown, certainly as far as England is concerned. It did force them to start to move in a different direction. They're not impervious to criticism. They're not impervious to public opinion. And so actually, for at that crucial moment, almost uniformly, our media, not only to not challenge that narrative, but to actually promote it, I think will be really a national shame, a shame on our journalist class long after this crisis. I have no doubt about that.
So journalists will be central to the public inquiry that follows.
Absolutely.
Tom and Victor, did you want to add to that? I don't know if there's anything that you wanted to add, Victor, specifically in terms of Trump's the press briefings, not just, this is not just the media failing to preempt, but this is now, a president who is preaching outright misinformation, and whether the media was strong enough in holding him to account. But either of you two want to chip in quickly?
I'll jump in, since you triggered me mentioning Trump. I assumed we would get to him at some point, but I mean, the press briefings are obviously a circus, a spectacle, and in many cases, even as the press perform this kind of adversarial role, they're really just bit players in the Trump reality show. So it doesn't really deepen the discourse or shed light on anything. And in many cases, even perhaps inadvertently, when the press does try to challenge Trump on some of his most outrageous claims, like, we injecting ourselves with bleach or whatnot, they end up amplifying misinformation. So I think they're absolutely complicit. And again, not to harp on this too much, although I'm sure I will, but in many cases, when you're looking at the US system, it is these commercial imperatives that's driving so much of it. They have to sensationalize everything. They have to reduce it to a clash between personalities. It ends up trivializing, as Kerry-Anne was saying, these life and death issues. And so it's a real disservice.
Tom, could you say a bit more about what you describe as the symbiotic relationship between the journalist class and the government? And does that apply across the board? Is the BBC even more ensconced in that because of particular funding and regulatory questions? I'm just, what is the nature of this symbiotic?
Yeah, I mean, the context of the BBC, I think, is, there's obviously a lot going on here, but in pretty broad terms, I mean, the BBC has a closer relationship to the government or the state in that it's dependent on the government for its funding and its continuation of resistance. So they're very responsive to political pressure, but also the sorts of people who are at the top of the BBC, they're always having to kind of navigate that policy environment, and that tends to inform the broader kind of risk-averse editorial culture of the BBC. I mean, there's also the fact that the BBC tends to be put under much more pressure from the right than, say, Sky or ITV and these commercial outlets, which are also, have a greater degree of independence really than the BBC exhibits. I mean, that's basically because of the domination of the BBC in the media environment. The BBC is so prestigious, it's got such a large audience. It's very important to them, if they're trying to sort of maintain control over the communications, to focus on the BBC. So the BBC, is a sort of status organisation with a kind of quasi-autonomy from the government. So that's one thing, and then that's obviously different to the relationship between the conservative press and the government, which is, first of all, those institutions are much more partisan. I mean, and they really are much more part of that sort of powerful infrastructure of conservatism in this country, and they're much they're different to the BBC insofar as, you know, they will overtly cheerlead for the government, and they'll also spread disinformation in the way that the BBC won't. But it's perfectly conceivable, you know, that these organisations in different circumstances will turn on a government in a way that I think the BBC just won't, or at least not to the same extent. If a government seems to fall out of favour, and, you know, this really hasn't happened for a long time, but I mean, I suppose the last week, you know, you could arguably see the last days of Gordon Brown or John Major as being the periods where this happened, where the press had really turned on the government. The BBC, I think, will tend to follow suit with that, but not quite to the same degree. So I think, you know, there's a degree of like notional independence with the press, but I mean, in reality, you know, they are part of the same organized interests of which the Conservative Party is part of. So it's a rather different kind of, they're rather different institutions. I mean, insofar as they're all part of the same process, I mean, you know, they're all part of this system that we call the lobby, which is this group of political journalists whose skills rely on access to unattributed briefings from Downing Street, whose sort of stock in trade is insider gossip and an understanding of the sort of ins and outs of the Westminster system and the rest of it. So about, I think there's like 200 or so lobby journalists, maybe around a fifth of them are at the BBC. So those people are very much part of the same crowd. You know, the BBC, it's sometimes we can think of it as being a very distinct institution because it has very different news values, but at the same time, they, you know, I mean, to put it crudely, like they're all doing very similar jobs traditionally in Westminster, right? I mean, it's a slightly different situation now because we're in lockdown. They all follow each other on Twitter, and the people at the BBC all read the same newspapers. So, you know, they are part of the same sort of what they like to call groupthink, you know. And so, yeah, I think there are differences, but broadly speaking, they are kind of part of the same scene, and they're also part of the same sort of social milieu. You know, they all come, like the government, from similar sorts of schools. They would attend similar kinds of universities. They come from a relatively very wealthy part of society, which gives them to some extent, a shared set of understandings and ideologies, which creates that kind of, you know, congruity, I think.
Thank you very much for that. Just a couple of questions more from me, but one is I mean, one of the moments that I remember quite well during the pandemic was when the Sunday Times did its job and did a really great piece of investigative journalism. And everyone fell over themselves because the Sunday Times did a great piece of investigative journalism. Shock horror. I'm just wondering, you know, the journalists like to tell people like us that we are generalizing. So when you criticize the BBC, they say, what about the panorama? You know, we're so used to spending our time trying to complain to the BBC about their hatchet jobs on Corbyn, and then suddenly they do a very good panorama. Kerry-Anne, you mentioned Piers Morgan. Enough said. How do you explain, all three of you, these interruptions of normal business when mainstream journalists do their job? Does it just illustrate the scale of the crisis? I mean, what's going on? Kerry-Anne, you can start.
Yeah, I think kind of several things are going on. Sometimes it's a message, to be frank. You know, sometimes it's as simple as the paper has temporarily fallen out with the government on an issue and it's flexing its muscles. And it's, you know, it's sort of, you know, there's a bit of to and fro there in a negotiation. And it can be as simple as, you know, wanting an exclusive interview with, you know, another minister or, you know, whatever the case may be. So there are those sort of superficial issues. And then there are others where it's kind of like, even the fact that we're even having that conversation is terrifying and depressing to me at the same time, of just like, you know, one journalist one day actually does what their job is to do, and we sort of want to do a victory lap about it. I'm forgetting the phrase now in my excitement, but it, you know, it underscores the issue. The exception proves the rule. There you go. And I actually think there's something else that's actually even more dangerous about when that happens. It's the illusion of a free press. And it's almost like Victor was talking about, whereas the BBC does do quality output on occasion, the Sunday Times will do a decent investigation on occasion. You know, the Financial Times Chris, you know, at the Financial Times, who's Chris Giles, who's putting together the you know, the estimated death data, is doing a fantastic job through this crisis. But the issue with that is almost that becomes a problem in itself, because it kind of conjures this false image, as if, which people really believe still, by the way, that Britain has this free press. You know, it's a world leader in the free press, when we're languishing way down the tables in terms of the World Press Freedom Index. So that sort of, I guess it kind of bleeds into those sort of latent sense of English exceptionalism and all of those kinds of things, that people still believe that, you know, one article, one investigation, the odd decent panorama, rather than being something positive that we can take away, even though we'll amplify that story and carry it to as many people as possible. I think it does grant them an air of legitimacy, as if they're journalists, when we know that sort of 90% of the time they're stenographers.
Okay, the other, Victor and Tom, you may want to come back on this, but can I move straight to the audience questions, because there's some really good ones. There's one that specifically develops Kerry-Anne's point, which is, and I'm going to illustrate the question because I'm in my office, I have some books here. The question is, isn't the real role of journalism, to take an old Chomsky point, just to distract us, at best to distract us with the illusion that we're well informed, that we know what we need to know, that we're on top of things. So, asks this questioner, sorry, there are no names attached. So, why are we so surprised by any of this? Tom or Victor?
Well, I started by saying I'm not surprised, so I'm probably not the best person to answer the question. I mean, I think the thing is with manufacturing consent is, you know, sometimes people take that title as being the main sort of thrust of the book, but it's not really. I mean, what that book's describing is the structure of these kind of institutions, and not just their institutions, but their relationship to other social institutions, including the state, which, you know, we've talked about a bit. Now, what does that end up leading up to? They basically have this model of how the press in the US operate, and, you know, there are different other kinds of models which would apply maybe slightly differently to the UK, and particularly, you know, I've tried to do something similar, I suppose, for the BBC in a less sort of schematic fashion. One of the things that they show in that book is really very striking findings as a content analysis, and people often ignore this, but they describe in great detail, and to my knowledge it's never been convincingly refuted, what the particular patterns of reporting are. And I think in a way this leads back to, and I don't think, by the way, just to respond particularly to this questionnaire, that the overwhelming message is that the people are distracted. I mean, really the point of the thrust of that book is that the media creates the image of a free and broad spectrum of opinion, whereas actually empirically that is not the case. And I think that definitely applies here, but it's not necessarily the people are being even willfully misleaded. It's more like that's a function of the way that these institutions are structured, right? So I think that's kind of an important point in how we think about this. To pick up on the point that was made earlier about what are these institutions doing, why can we see these pockets of, you know, good reporting? I mean, I think, you know, it's sort of a cliche to say that book exaggerates the extent of homogeneity in the media, but I think it's fine. I mean, but that's what models do. All models are sort of schematic. In terms of, I think it's significant where those two particular pieces of journalism came from that you mentioned, like the Insight team and Panorama, because, you know, these are the remnants of once genuinely quite interesting programs with particular histories dating back to the history of investigative journalism in the country, which has still maintained some sort of more autonomy from the kind of news machine, you know. So it's significant that they come from there. And I agree with the other points that were made in terms of, like, you know, the particular diplomacy that goes on and assuming particular editorial lines. No doubt it would have been, the BBC would have looked at that panorama in a lot of detail. Certainly they put everything to the government. It was very carefully checked, and it was certainly would have been seen as a useful way of demonstrating their independence from government, which of course to some extent it does. Sorry, I feel like I'm going on a bit, but I want to make one last important point, which is that when we talk about what institutions, big institutions like the BBC or the Sunday Times or any other organization does, we're not talking about what they always do. We're talking about what they tend to do. We're talking about trends. And this is the same with any kind of institution. So pointing to something that gets done occasionally and saying, well, this is evidence of this, I mean, obviously it doesn't stand up if you think about it for 5 seconds. It's like saying, oh, well, there's no racism in Britain because look at this black person who's achieved wealth or fame, right? Obviously, if we want to know how societies and big organizations function, we look at what they tend to do, not what they always do or always don't do. And the evidence on how the BBC and the press reports, you know, there's a lot of content analysis on this. We know a lot about this from social science, which gets ignored by people like Nick Robinson, but we know. And I can see of no compelling reason why I could expect to see any departure from those findings in the current circumstances, just in terms of, you know, just viewing the coverage, which, you know, I've been doing just like anybody else who's on this panel who's been watching at home. So yeah, you know, Panorama and the Insights team, good. Like you said, it's good to see some independent journalism. You know, I'd be happy to give them a little round of applause, but it would be nice if we could actually get these institutions to do something more effective on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, thank you. Right, I'm a rubbish chair because we've got so many great questions here. So Victor, you might want to carry on thinking about whether we are being amused to death, but could you do that in the context of answering another question, which is how do you imagine the huge media job losses caused by the pandemic might impact the future viability of progressive critical journalism?
Yes, so I'm going to try to link all these questions together. I just want to add to what Tom said about, you know, manufacturing consent and how it really is trying to make sense of how power operates through our media systems, but also looking at the structural causes for these patterns in coverage. And another very important book that I wanted to mention that I think makes sense of also these exceptions, these acts of agency and courageous reporting that we occasionally see, although ideally we'd see all the time. I would direct your viewers to read the book Contradictions of Media Power by a scholar named Des Freedman. I think that tries to bring into focus why, and I wasn't paid to say that. This isn't a native advertising. So, but as far as the loss of news jobs, absolutely that hurts progressives. And I think those of us on the left often don't think in these terms, where it's our instinct is to criticize mainstream media narratives. But I think we also need to look at what happens to our social movements, whether we're concerned about global warming or gross inequalities. We're going to need journalism. We're going to need viable journalists. So the point is not just to shore up these failing commercial models, the advertising revenue model's dead, but how do we remake something from the ashes and create a truly democratic news media system?
And we're going to come back to that towards the end of what that might look like, but we haven't let the mainstream off the hook quite yet. I thought those were very interesting and important answers, thinking about whether we are surprised or not. I mean, it is worth saying that, for example, the attack on the teachers' unions at the moment, I don't think that is overwhelmingly popular. You know, it certainly hasn't worked with teachers. The vast majority of them are still actually holding firm to the idea of going back to school when it is safe for children, parents, and the workers themselves. Thousands are joining the teachers' unions. So, you know, it's not as if there is just an easy, you know, brainwashing model that goes on. However, another really interesting question, I guess Kerry-Anne might be, you've kind of touched on this a little bit. We were told that the government were following this, I guess, following the science. So why didn't broadcasters use science specialists and epidemiologists to ask questions instead of political lobbyists at the outset?
I think there are two reasons. One is over the last 10 to 15 years, there has been a mass culling of specialist correspondent positions across the press and broadcast news. You know, whereas, you know, before you would have, you know, a health team, a science team built, you know, of specialists, you know, who had a background not only in journalism, but in the field in which they were talking, so that they weren't just asking political questions. They could ask those sort of really, I hate to use this word in the current context, but forensic questions of, you know, politicians, and so they, in essence, they could spot where they were being sold a lemon, and they could challenge it, and they could do so with an authority that political correspondents just simply won't have. You know, with the best will in the world, you can't be an expert on everything. And I think I just wanted to touch on something quickly in that regard, if I could just take a moment. There is an independent scientific advisory group for emergencies that's set up, which is chaired by the former Chief Medical Officer, David King. And it's just littered with some of the best scientists in the UK. And they came out in response to the government letting us know the attendees or what was actually the advice given in their scientific advisory group on emergencies. And they're sort of meeting about weekly at the moment. They're broadcasting on YouTube, they're holding press conferences. And I would really just urge anyone on this now to go and watch that. And that is what happens when you actually have a credible scientific process happening. You know, the questions, even with political journalists, but you have, you know, the BMJ, the Lancet, those sort of journalists, even in the daily briefings, let alone an independent Sage, are generally the ones who are asking the best questions. You know, if you guys are watching the daily briefings, I'm sitting there waiting for the BMJ, waiting, you know, for the Lancet, because those are the people that are really getting in there and defying really the narrative that's being produced before them. So I think there's two things people at home can do. One is listen to those questioners, you know, pay attention, don't switch off because it's not, you know, the Mirror or a title that you necessarily recognize. And two, go away and have a look at Independent Sage so that you can see what actual scientific approach looks like, and what a scientific conversation looks like, and what the current actual best advice is.
Thank you very much. That's great. I want to interrupt this critique to pose an optimistic, a positive question. Tom, probably best to go to you on it. It's a comment actually, but you can still reflect on the comment. I think we could all acknowledge that Channel 4 News has provided an alternative picture of what's happening. Their journalism traveling outside London has been exemplary. Their banning from government briefings speaks volumes. Did you want to reflect on that and what it might, you know, whether it's possible within the confines, you know, to break out and start to pose, you know, important questions?
It's not, you know, there's no sort of magical reason why journalism has to be bad. You know, we can create different institutions very effectively, and Channel 4 News is by far the best broadcasting news that we have. I mean, it's all, you know, and in most of the studies it finds they have a much broader spectrum of opinion. They ask much more critical questions, which is why the Conservative Party are constantly boycotting them and depriving them of any proper interviewee. So I agree, you know, Channel 4 News is not always brilliant, but it tends to be much better than the BBC. And it's partly the fact that, you know, the BBC, because of its prestige, it gets the big names on, and it tends to then become more orientated, and you get that sort of elite capture that you mentioned earlier. You know, Channel 4 News it's sort of set up as an alternative source of news, you know, and they have a slightly different professional ethos. But yeah, it shows what you can do if you, on a smaller budget, if you approach journalism differently. I agree.
Yeah, and we will continue. We will get back to this in terms of the new models for independent journalism. The person who asked the very first question, I'm just saving it for last, so don't be impatient. It's there on the screen. But this is a great question. If I could start with you, Victor, and then Kerry-Anne as a journalist, be very interested to hear your answer. We've seen both Trump and the BBC try and succeed in banning journalists from briefings, asking questions, etc., which is becoming a new norm. Why don't journalists take a stand and walk out or switch off their mics and their cameras if they're so interested in defending the freedom of the press? Isn't there some kind of general agreement on this? So it's particularly the case with Trump. I'm aware, that was the question. I'm aware that there was a group of journalists and journalist academics in the US who gathered a petition together to say that actually Trump's press briefings should no longer be broadcast live because they're dangerous. So I don't actually know what's happened to that, but be very interested to hear your answers. Why don't journalists just walk out if they want to defend press freedom?
Yeah, I'll jump on it first. And the easy answer is, I don't know. It's a great question. I was one of the signers of that letter that you referenced. I do believe that it is, again, it's doing a disservice for democratic society to amplify this misinformation. But there are all kinds of explanations. Some of them are cultural, some of them are economic. I mean, basic economic explanations don't suffice because they don't even typically run commercials during these briefings. So usually I would say, oh, it's about the ratings, it's about delivering eyeballs to advertisers. But I think that the elite media don't want to lose that access to power. And that's part of the problem.
Kerry-Anne, would you advocate that?
Yeah, I absolutely would. But I think I'd actually go further than that, because I think simply turning the camera off and walking away isn't good enough. I actually think it's about correcting that information and producing the best possible journalism that you can outside of that system. Why, again, independent Sage, you could have Channel 4 hosting an independent Sage, each night, or the BBC doing that, and actually giving the public that en masse opportunity to see what this looks like when it's done well. That would be a great service that they could offer. I could come up with a list of 5 things probably that I would want to do fairly immediately if I had the power to do so. But I think it comes back to the kind of points that Victor and Tom have both made about the institutional nature of the crisis that we're facing in journalism, because the assumption is that those organizations are committed to providing the kind of journalism that we believe should be happening right now. And increasingly what we're seeing is that isn't the case. They are geared essentially to stay within the confines of acceptability as determined by that elite group. And what we have seen, what happens to a journalist when they step outside of those confines. I think the most recent example in the UK context would be Peter Oborne, who kind of gave a public denunciation of his own profession, which was brutally honest and clearly supported by the facts. And he was treated as a heretic. The sort of gossip about him, the sort of abuse, and that's what tends to happen is you find if you do get a sort of rogue journalist who kind of girds their loins and says, okay, right, I'm going to do this, I'm going to make a move, the pack enforces the culture on them. So it's no small feat for a journalist. That journalist is really kind of saying, I'm no longer going to operate in this space because the rules of operating in this space are I stay in this sandpit. And if I put my toe out, they'll throw me out the whole thing.
So one of your homeworks from tonight is to read the Peter Oborne piece in Open Democracy. Just search for it a couple of years ago. It's quite a powerful piece. Right, we've got about 15 minutes left, I think. Still a number of questions to get through. Could we talk about trust, I suppose? It was raised, Kerry-Anne raised it, but here's a question. Tom, we'll go to you first on it, if that's all right. I find it frustrating, says the questioner, to have to work so hard to be able to believe or trust so much of the information that is readily available. I want to be objective, but it's awfully easy to get into the echo chamber and end up adhering to stuff that supports only how I think or feel. In a way, is it a sensible strategy? And did you have anything else to contribute about trust? In particular, because even though there are very low trust ratings for journalists, it appears, as it's put to us, that broadcasters still are maintaining, and the BBC still maintaining higher levels of trust than certainly the print journalists, and much, much more than social media.
Yeah, no, I think the thing is that's all in line with all the existing trust data we had anyway. I mean, it was all, every year Ofcom does this news consumption survey and they ask people to rank different media in terms of what they trust. And we knew already, I mean, the journalists seem to ignore all this data because it doesn't always look good for them. But we already knew that people don't trust the tabloids and they trust the Guardian sometimes more than the BBC. And that's consistent, but also it makes sense. I mean, the professional values of the BBC much higher than the Daily Mail or the Sun, which are just so you can be sure if you read something in the Sun that you've probably read something that's untrue or misleading. Whereas if you hear something on the BBC, you're probably not hearing some relevant detail, or maybe there's things missing which may mislead you in one way or another, partly because they're relaying messages from the government, but they don't tend to report things that, I mean, apart from their recent reporting on the Labour Party, which was very, very poor, they don't tend to report things which are outright inaccuracies. So I mean, I think that's all fine. Like, it depends how you ask these questions. I mean, when they were doing, the BBC was doing their own survey on how much people trust the BBC, somebody from Ipsos Mori came and knocked on my door and asked me how much I trust the BBC. And of course, yeah, and of course I said that I trusted the BBC because the way that they phrase the questions means that yes, you know, for the most part, it's a better news source than reading The Sun, you know. So none of that is very surprising. If you dig in a little bit more, I agree. It creates this sort of problem of like, how can I trust? How do I know what information I'm not getting? I mean, it is very difficult, you know. And the only way you can try and do it is try and orientate yourself towards a different selection of sources. Try and be an intelligent, discriminating consumer, or I don't like the word, of news, but I agree, it's a very difficult environment. And I think if you find somebody whose analysis you usually trust, and have a selection of people who, you know, usually offering good analyses, and you check their sources and you look at a bunch of different things, it's the only way that you can really deal with that kind of environment. I'm sorry, that's not very good advice, and that's what we all have to do.
Thank you. Victor, I think we have to go to you in terms of the US if we're going to talk about silos, echo chambers, and such a partisan state of politics. Anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, I mean, it's a similar situation in the States. I don't think there's been any major change except what might be expected in an early stage of any crisis, that people are glued more to official news sources. So there might have been a spike in trust. When you start talking about the partisan aspect, I think it's interesting. There's certainly a newfound concern, just as there was right after Trump's election in 2016, among progressives in particular, about the health of the fourth estate. Now this might be a little bit more broadly, even among conservatives. They're, as much as they hate the media, when you then talk about their local newspaper or their local broadcaster, they get warm, fuzzy feelings about those institutions. So I think there's growing concern about the death of local journalism. But beyond that, it's just very politicized and polarized in the States as it was before the pandemic.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, so now it's 7 o'clock. We are winding down a little bit, but we're moving to the most important question, really, which is about what can we do in terms of a solution. So can I put two questions together? So you either have to write them down or just remember, more than I can ever do. So first of all, how can the left tell our story with the state and corporate media determined to delete it? So how can we tell our story? But also in terms of being part of that story, there is a separate question that says, when we're thinking about reclaiming the media, are funding and staff diversity the key? Or are the media structurally more than just the sum of their parts? So if we can introduce some, notions around the importance of diversity and the media itself reflecting the populations on whom it's supposed to be reporting and representing. Kerry-Anne.
Yeah, in terms of how the left can tell our story, I am just super proud to be a part of independent media, particularly at this moment. It's not just the Canary. There are a whole fleet of new outlets that are doing really exceptional work right now, and I'm really on nowhere near the budgets or without the kinds of access that the mainstream has. And that actually, even though obviously a lot of this is quite tough content and fairly depressing, actually fills me with optimism, because it's not like we're lacking the initiative or the skill or the capability to do this. It's just our ability to sort of manifest that in reality takes time. It really does take time to build new organizations. And certainly the Canary today is not the same thing it was in year one. Our ability to generate original journalism now is far in excess of where we were in our first year, and I'm really excited about where that's going to be in another 5 years. But for me, it was never about like the Canary becoming the Sun or the Times or whatever, or getting some sort of monopoly. It was about diversity of voices. Don't just read the Canary and support the Canary. Go and read others. Read Open Democracy, read Red Pepper, read New Intel. Go out and get this amazing richness, these totally diverse voices, even on the left. That's before you've even moved out of the left. You have many different styles and kind of approaches to conducting that journalism. So I think really it's about building those platforms, and it's about supporting them. It's about taking out subscriptions with those outlets and supporting them so that they can, create the sort of working conditions for journalists that mean they can do that full time, they can stay on that task, and follow all of these leads through to their very ends, rather than sort of rushing out think pieces and columns, but actually take the time that it does to conduct really thorough, investigative, original journalism, because that's the stuff that takes the time and costs the money.
And diversifying newsrooms?
Yeah, and on diversifying newsrooms, I mean, this was like mission one for us when we set up, because what frustrates me, and an example would be Priti Patel or Boris Johnson's cabinet more widely. That's an example of what I'm talking about when I say tokenistic diversity, where you go, well, isn't it great? We've got a person of colour, as Home Secretary. And it's like, well, no, because how she got permission to be that Home Secretary was she had to act in exactly the same way a white Home Secretary would have acted, and pass one of the most egregious, immigration bills in the history of the country. So no, that's not progress, that's tokenism. That's again the veneer of diversity, when what's actually happening is a tightening of that homogenous sort of elite situation. And it's the same in journalism. If Tom's touched on it and I've talked about it, ad infinitum, is that we talk about diversity in newsrooms, but what happens is you basically have all of the journalists in that newsroom come from like 6 universities. 6. They've often had very, very similar backgrounds, same school, all of that stuff. They hang around in the same circles, they go to the same pubs, all of this sort of stuff. So it's almost like this just circle where there's just this feedback loop internally. They're only really checking agreement amongst themselves, and there's no external voices. And that's why genuine diversity is so important, because it's not a tokenistic gesture. It's not like, oh, let's be kind and more moral and let a few more brown people in, or let's let a few more working class people in. It's because each person that you bring in, every time you expand your diversity, you are welcoming in a whole world of new perspective, opinion, experience, ability to tell the stories that we need to tell. So if your newsroom doesn't look like modern Britain, you're not going to be able to reflect that back to your readers, and you're not even going to know you're not doing it. That's the real issue. So that's what I would say, is that diversity is important. In terms of funding, always difficult. We have constant conversations about the conditions that we have on funding. We still haven't moved out and got private donors or anything like that yet. We're still running a subscription model, because we're conscious that we don't even want to kind of get in a situation where we're tempted to have our kind of editorial positions limited. And I think, to be honest, to keep having that conversation with yourself is half the job. It's just to keep yourself in that mindset of, we are all susceptible to this. It's not like independent journalists are great and morally courageous and journalists in the mainstream space aren't. We are all susceptible to those same pressures. If I'd have been socialized and put into that environment, I'd probably be doing the same things that they are. So it's about how, when we build a new media, we try and stop that process happening in the first place, so we don't have to kind of capitulate to the worst elements of our nature.
Thank you very much. Right, Tom, before you talk about how we tell our story, it was as if this comment had you in mind in terms of, I think, rebutting it, So it's a comment. The mistake I feel the left make is that they show all their cards. The right are sly, much media that has an agenda but eases the reader or viewer in. Should left-wing media tone it down in order to pull people in? It's similar, I feel, to the election of Corbyn. They could have toned it down, offered less, and then delivered more when in government. It's too much wearing of the left's heart on their sleeve. End quote.
I mean, I don't really recognize it. If it's a reference to sort of recent history of the left, I don't really recognize it. I mean, Corbyn and Corbynism were constantly toning down the programme and just got monstered nevertheless. And we've seen recently, Keir Starmer, who you can't imagine a more toned down Labour leader, being monstered by the Daily Mail for owning a donkey sanctuary or something ridiculous. So, I think that comes a little bit back to this question of, what should the left's relationship be to these kinds of institutions? And I think the institutions of the state, as much as the media, and I think it has to be an oppositional position. Otherwise, you just end up being dragged and pulled into this sort of centre of gravity. And I think in terms of going back to the question, the question before about how should the left sort of tell its story. I mean, we shouldn't accept that the media is going to misrepresent the left, because it shouldn't be doing that. It's a violation of their professional duties, and we should call them out on that and pressurize them, but we shouldn't be surprised by it. You know, no one should be surprised the way the BBC responded to the rise of Jeremy Corbyn or the way that the press responded. They will only respond, though, not to being nice to them, but to appeal to their professional integrity, right? We should do that. We should point out how they should report. But number two, we do, and Kerry-Anne's already made this point, need to have an infrastructure, an independent infrastructure, whereby the left as a movement, this to me is a slightly different question as to what we should do about the BBC, needs to be able to represent itself. And because the media, a set of institutions, is able to perform that function for the right, the left doesn't have that set of infrastructure. So that's why I think what people should do is they should support independent media. They should pressurize the establishment media to just do their job, i.e. do what, for example, it says in the BBC Charter. Like, that would be nice. I don't think we need to ask for much more than that.
It would be nice. Victor, before you, well, as part of your answer of how we should tell our story, I mean, we should direct people to your op-ed piece yesterday in the Washington Post, which is a really interesting piece of history where you talk about, I never hadn't been aware of it, of a municipally owned, quote, people's newspaper in Los Angeles over 100 years ago, which was overseen, by directly elected officials. Can you imagine that? What for you, you're committed to a version of public media that would allow us to tell our own stories. So could you say more about that? But also, for those of us who are slightly more concerned in the UK, how do we know it's not going to end up like the paternalistic public service media we have now?
Great, yes, I'll definitely end on that note, and I'll just start out by saying that I agree that we can't give up on trying to tell our stories in mainstream media. It always has to be a two-pronged project where we press mainstream media, get our stories out there to as many people as possible, but also grow our own infrastructure. So I think these aren't mutually exclusive projects. They're both and, not either or. Talking about mainstream media, we also have to consider an important point of leverage around news workers themselves. At least in the US right now, you're seeing a growing level of class consciousness and solidarity. There's unionization efforts in many newsrooms across the states. And we have to remember, so much of our criticism is focused on the star elite journalists and outlets. And I think we need to realize that these journalists, many of them are allies, or at least potential allies. In the US, similar as we were just hearing about here, we have what are called little magazines like Jacobin that have played an outsized role in expanding the political discourse. So it shows you the potential power of independent media. It's helped contribute to this growing new socialism in the United States. I think is very exciting. But going to the second question about funding and diversity, I think those two problems are very much interlinked. That as long as we're relying on a commercialized media system or a system that's too close to the state, this is hostile terrain. We're always going to be constrained in how much our stories get out there. But if we can unhook the funding mechanisms that lead to a democratized system, and this is what Des was getting at. And speaking of elite media, I was able to get a fairly radical piece in the Washington Post. But it was hearkening back to this historical experiment where the local communities owned and controlled their own news outlets. These kinds of models can let journalists be journalists. They can create newsrooms that look like the communities that they serve, that indeed are owned and controlled by those communities. So I think that's the kind of the real utopian vision that we should be working towards on the left.
Nothing utopian about it. It's just difficult. Right. So finally, just by way of conclusion, I wondered if the three of you wanted to give me your worst headline of the pandemic or your worst example of the pandemic, or just a concluding point before we wind up. Kerry-Anne?
If I could do two, I'll make them very quick. The first one was watching the BBC. This was broadcast. I'll do one broadcast and one headline. Broadcast was, I believe it was yesterday or the day before, and the framing on the BBC about this, what is really a battle of life and death between the government and teachers right now, to maintain their own health and safety, but also the health and safety of the school children and their communities, defined as a squabble. And you just knew that came from Dominic Cummings. You just knew that was the framing. And I was kind of getting increasingly angry at this. And I go, oh, you can't call it a squabble. And she then proceeded to say the word squabble no fewer than 11 times in 3 minutes. That is astounding when you think it's hammering you over the head, squabble, squabble, squabble. The other thing, also similar field, was Sky, sadly. Sky had a headline, I think it was the day after Boris Johnson had told everyone that isn't middle class and can work from home, that they've got to go out and face the virus on their own, basically. And, but don't use public transport. Yeah, which is just ridiculous. You can't force a whole bunch of people out to work and then say, don't use public transport. And the Sky headline was, commuters ram London Tube despite government's warning not to use public transport. And you just knew that was the tack they were going to take, is to force people into a situation where they cannot maintain their own health and safety, and then to blame them for doing it. You know, on social media, I was kind of comparing it to the idea that you're hanging someone and then blaming them for hogging the rope. You know, is that sort of absolutely crazy mentality that they're using at the moment. So those would be my two picks.
I think one philosopher once said, being determines consciousness. And if you spent your life as a senior journalist getting in and out of cabs, you know, your experience of public transport is a bit different.
Exactly.
Okay, those brilliant examples. Tom?
Yeah, I mean, actually, that Sky one really stood out for me. It was a small headline, but it was just one of those ones that you just sort of look at, just like completely aghast. Like, what on earth? You know, how could you think that headline was okay? You know, it's just remarkable. I mean, I don't know if it's necessarily the worst, but the headline, I mean, apart from that one, which is a bit more fresh in my mind, that stood out for me was last month around Easter time, when the BBC ran the headline, Herculean effort to provide NHS protective care, at the point at which, you know, it became clear that the people who, you know, the government had been encouraging us to clap every day were being put, you know, in an incredibly difficult, dangerous position due to the government's incompetence. And the way that the BBC reported on that was to say that, look at the government trying to address this. But the thing is that what was really, you know, like, grating about that headline was this habit of the BBC to take a government line, put it in inverted commas, and just use the quote to basically frame the nature of the story, which is basically just to say, oh, you know, that they get fed a line by the government, and then that becomes the headline. And then the response when you try and push back on that is always, well, they did say that, you know, as if that's what's being contended. I mean, it's some of the worst practices, I think, of elite journalism, and so it really stood out for me.
Thank you. Real people making real decisions. They don't just emerge spontaneously onto the screen. Victor, any headlines or examples?
Yeah, some very general examples, more like genres. And one is very similar to what Tom was saying, which is, you know, having the quote of what someone actually said, but completely decontextualized in the headline. There's all these, I already hinted at this earlier, but this sort of Trump said headlines. You know, Trump said that the coronavirus is like the flu, you know, things like that, that just blast out this misinformation, even as they appear to be critical or adversarial. The more recent genre is where, to use a terrible pun, where news outlets try to trump up the drama, you know, between individuals and personalities. And former President Obama gave a very lightly critical speech recently, where he criticized how the current administration's handling the pandemic. And this was trumped up into, you know, Obama, CNN said Obama gave a scathing critique of the chaotic administration. And then Karl Rove on Fox News said he likened it to a political drive-by shooting, which of course also has, you know, racial overtones. And so this plays very well through social media. It gets tweeted out. It's irresistible. But this is what really, instead of looking at the structural damage, for example, what we're dealing with in the States with a profit-driven healthcare system, instead of having stories like that, we're focused on these little spats between politicians.
Thank you very much. That was wonderful. There is one more question which I'm going to answer, because it's a very short answer. It's a very specific question. Do you think there's any chance of another Leveson inquiry, which enforces much more severe consequences on propaganda in the mail and so on? For those who don't know, the Leveson inquiry was something that took place well, in the most recent decade, which was an attempt to shed light on the practices of the press after the phone hacking scandal. I think the answer to that is no, absolutely no way. The only way of enacting the spirit of the Leveson inquiry will be precisely through the kinds of what you're seeing the teachers' unions doing in trying to ensure safety for parents, students, and their own members. I don't think there'll be an official government inquiry. It's what ordinary people do to ensure that we are trying to get the answers and trying to keep our communities safe. One final comment, which is what we haven't had time to discuss, is there's a big debate about what is a journalist. And of course, just right at the very end, I can't remember which one of you was just, it was Victor talking about the kind of stenography we see in parts of the US system. And we certainly have that in the UK. Anyone, we are told that when Laura Kuenssberg says in a tweet very often, number 10 says, she's a journalist, she's an accredited journalist. Very few of us believe that number 10 says is a form of journalism. That is just stenography. But I wanted to end in terms of who is a journalist and who isn't, by urging us to remember a journalist who is at the moment locked up in Belmarsh prison awaiting deportation because Julian Assange is not seen as a journalist, even though what he's done, the war crimes, the revelation of state secrets, for many people, that is an essential form of journalism. So I would encourage you, it's slightly outside the remit of this meeting on COVID, but it is happening right now. Please take the time to celebrate journalism in all its different guises and to think about supporting the Defend Assange campaign, which you can find at defendwikileaks.org. And once again, to thank three fantastic panelists for, you got through an awful lot of argument, information, detail. So I'd like to thank you once again. There's no clapping to be done here, but there's an awful lot of work for all of us.
Oh, we're clap. Well done, lads. Well done.
Thank you very much. And I hand over back to our official hosts at Writing on the Wall. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can we say a huge thank you to Kerry-Anne, Tom, Des, our host, and Victor. I've made so many notes every time we do one of these events. I'm like, we've talked about finding trusting sources for our news. The importance of telling our stories kept coming up time and time again, and I think that's something that really resonates with us here at Writing on the Wall. Kerry's point about the exception proves the rule and the illusion of a free press was quite worrying for me, and the growing concerns the implication of the loss of local news. Wonderful event. Keep your comments coming. If you've got any other feedback, send it through to us, share the event. Let's keep this conversation going. I'd like to take a little bit of time to thank our sponsors and funders, and that's Arts Council England, we've got Liverpool City Council, the Institute for Creative Enterprise at Edge Hill, Unison Northwest, and Liverpool John Moores University. Wellfest Lockdown is brought to you completely free of charge, and we are really proud of that. If you are able to, or you would like to make a donation, then please do. All of our donations are being split between Fans for Food Banks, South Liverpool Domestic Abuse Service, and Writing on the Wall, and there'll be a little link in the comment section below. Like I said, check out the rest of our events. We've got lots to come this week and then next. We've got Jeremy Corbyn finishing up our festival on the 31st, followed by the one and only Levi Tafari. There are monitoring forms. You never get out of this with Writing on the Wall, for those of you who know us well. There'll be another link in the comment section for that. This has been Media in Lockdown. I've been Emma. Please keep safe. Thanks a lot.